All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a piece of history that sounds completely made up, but I assure you it is 100% real. We're talking about the time humanity literally declared war on a flock of birds. It's a wild story, but we're going to look past the obvious military blunders here and see what this bizarre conflict actually tells us about our relentless need to try and control the natural world. So here's the big question we need to tackle right out of the gate. How on earth does a modern industrialized army lose a military campaign to flightless wildlife? To wrap our heads around this, we have to realize that the government essentially sent in uniformed, combat-ready soldiers to handle what they thought was going to be just a routine wildlife management operation. Spoiler alert, they massively underestimated their opponent. It's what you might call a flipped Goliath mismatch. On one side, you've got the Royal Australian Artillery, right? Lumbering, heavy, armed to the teeth with Lewis machine guns, and trained for structured mechanical infantry combat. And on the flip side, 20,000 emos. Just absolute organic chaos, sprinting at 50 kilometers an hour in these totally unpredictable zigzag patterns. It was the ultimate showdown between rigid human systems and the wild, unpredictable natural world. Now, the stage for all this was actually set during the Great Depression. The government had given marginal land in Western Australia to discharged World War I veterans, basically pushing them to grow more wheat. But with the Depression hitting hard, wheat prices were absolutely tanking. So these farmers are already barely scraping by when a totally unexpected threat literally appears on the horizon. Here's the twist. By clearing that land and building up water supplies for their livestock, these farmers accidentally created a five-star resort for wildlife. Further inland, there was a brutal drought, forcing emus to migrate west looking for food and water. When these giant birds crested the hills and spotted the freshly cultivated wheat fields of the Campion district, well, they found their absolute oasis. And we are not talking about a small, stray flock here. We are talking about 20,000 migrating emus descending on the wheat belt. That is a mind-boggling number of birds. And they didn't just eat the wheat, they completely trashed the crops, trampled the fields, and, this is crucial, they busted massive holes in the exclusion fences. That let rabbits flood in, causing even more destruction. The farmers were staring down absolute financial ruin. So what do you do? Well, these veteran farmers remembered the brutal efficiency of machine guns from the trenches of the First World War. They actually sent a deputation to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, and flat out demanded military weapons. And amazingly, Pierce agreed, mostly to show government support for these struggling vets, but also, he kind of thought it'd be good target practice for the troops. He was so confident, he actually sent a Fox Movietone cinematographer along to film what was supposed to be a glorious propaganda victory. I mean, you literally can't make this up. The government deploys Major Gwyneth Purves Wyn Aubrey Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. He heads out with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis light machine guns, and exactly 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission? Exterminate the birds. The plan was incredibly simple. Set up the guns, point them at the flak, and let the sheer firepower do all the heavy lifting. But over the course of just 6 days, the whole thing devolves into an absolute tactical disaster. On November 2nd, the first ambush completely fails because the emus just immediately bolt out of range at breakneck speeds. 2 days later, November 4th, Meredith waits for 1,000 emus to gather at a dam. It's the perfect ambush, right? They open fire, bag about a dozen birds, and then the machine gun jams. The flock just vanishes into the scrub. By November 8th, after blowing through 2,500 rounds of ammo and killing maybe 50 birds, the deeply embarrassed military actually has to temporarily withdraw. Ornithologist Dominic Cerventi summed it up perfectly. He said the Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics. It's just so absurd, but it's completely true. The highly structured military was entirely outmatched by the birds' natural, erratic survival instincts. Those Lewis guns were built for stationary massed infantry warfare, not for tracking individual, lightning-fast targets scattering in literally every direction. The emus didn't fight back with force, they fought back with dispersal. So, following intense political pressure from the desperate farmers and the Premier of Western Australia, the military goes back into the field in mid-November. But the results were just as pathetic. It got so bad that politicians in Parliament literally started making jokes about minting medals for the emus and inviting the birds to apply for war pensions. Even Major Meredith himself was genuinely awestruck by his enemy. He noted that even when badly wounded, these emus had terrifying maneuverability and stamina. He famously wrote that if he had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. That is coming straight from the commander's official report. Let's break down exactly why this was such a spectacular failure. First off, the weapons were just completely wrong for the job. At one point, Meredith actually tried mounting a machine gun on a truck to chase the birds down, but the terrain was so unbelievably rough, the gunner couldn't even pull the trigger. But here's the real kicker, the most hilarious irony of the whole thing. When the machine guns fired, it panicked the emus, causing them to scatter at full speed, and those fleeing emus ended up trampling roughly 100 wheat plants for every single one they would have just eaten. So the military intervention was literally making the crop damage worse. By the time the military finally throws in the towel on December 10th, Major Meredith claimed 986 confirmed kills using 9,860 rounds of ammunition. Now, historians have pointed out that this suspiciously works out to an incredibly inefficient, perfectly exact ratio of 10 bullets fired per bird. It is highly likely they just artificially inflated that nice, neat number to make the whole embarrassing campaign look slightly less incompetent on paper. The big takeaway here is that heavy weapons of war simply weren't the answer to a localized ecological issue. After this highly publicized failure, the government wised up. They flat out denied further requests for military deployments in 1934, 1943, and 1948. Instead, they shifted gears to a civilian bounty system. And the raw data on this is just staggering. It absolutely proves how a simple, decentralized bounty system crushed the heavily armed military op. Look at this. Over a 6-month period in 1934, farmers acting independently claimed over 57,000 bounties. Compare that to the military's measly 986 kills back in 1932. It's night and day. Over the following decades, Australia also leaned heavily into massive infrastructure. Specifically, they built an exclusion barrier fencing system that stretched an incredible 1,170 kilometers. The goal was to simply block the migrating emus from entering the agricultural zones in the first place. It became a strategy of containment rather than outright militarized extermination. But let's look a little deeper, because the Emu War is so much more than just a funny historical quirk. It really serves as the ultimate historical case study of nature acting as an organic insurgency. Humans brought in their strict grids, their mechanized weapons, and this overwhelming desire to domesticate marginal land. The emus, they just brought their ancient biological imperatives, and they won, handily. As modern ecological writing often highlights, human systems constantly demand total calculation, predictability, and ruthless efficiency. We want to process and manage literally everything. But the living Earth continually resists that rigid domestication. It's chaotic, it's persistent, and, as we saw in 1932, it is vastly more resilient than our mechanical solutions. There's an ecological publication called Return Fire that argues our modern world is constantly trying to shrink everything down into an efficient, predictable dream world managed by technology. Looking through that lens, the emus of 1932 didn't issue demands, they didn't hold a protest, and they certainly didn't sit down to negotiate with the expansion of agriculture. They simply adapted, survived, and behaved exactly as nature intended, which completely shattered the human illusion of total control. So, that brings us to the end of this explainer. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. When we try to force total mechanical efficiency onto the beautifully unpredictable living Earth, using the blunt instruments of our own invention, who really wins in the end? Because if the Great Emu War taught us anything, it's that nature will always have a few incredibly fast, zigzagging tricks up its sleeve. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.